Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about the law of detachment. The law of detachment is something that has to do with deductive reasoning. It's a law that we use to help us when we're trying to solve problems using deductive reasoning. So if you haven't watched that video, you might want to check that one out first. Also, if you haven't watched the video on conditional statements, definitely check that one out first because I'm going to be using some terms that we sort of defined in those videos. But if you've watched those and you're ready to learn about the law of detachment, let's go ahead and let's get started. So let's first start off by defining what the law of detachment is. The law of detachment is a law of logic, hence why we use it for deductive reasoning, that states if a conditional statement and its hypothesis are true, then the conclusion is also true. So we know that we denote the conditional with the letters P and Q, and P is my hypothesis, and Q is our conclusion. So we know that if the conditional and hypothesis are true, then our conclusion has to be true. This is what the law of detachment states. So now let's go ahead and look at an example, and we're going to decide whether or not can we use the law of detachment. So let's go ahead and let's look at this first example. Let's read the instructions. It says, assume that each set of statements is true. Use the law of detachment to write a true statement. The law of detachment cannot be used. Explain why. So let's go ahead and let's read this sort of example to see if we can use the law of detachment. It says if you can play the piano, then you can play a musical instrument. Then it tells us Kyo can play a musical instrument. So let's look at the hypothesis. The hypothesis in our statement says that if you can play the piano. All right. Now, what they would like us to prove here essentially is that Kyo can play the piano. However, given the statement, we can't prove that. If the statement started off by saying, if you can play a musical instrument, then you can play the piano, then I would have been able to use this phrase that they gave me in the end to prove that Kyo can play the piano. However, the way this is written, as far as I know, Kyo can play the guitar, he can play the bass, he can play any other musical instrument other than piano, as long as it's a musical instrument. So unfortunately for this example, we are not able to use the law of detachment. This is an example where I'm not allowed to use the law of detachment. Now, if the sentence was written backwards, then I could have. If it would have said, if you can play a musical instrument, then you can play the piano, then I would have been able to say Kyo can play the piano. However, that's not the case. So let's go ahead and let's move on to another example. In this example, it says if the endpoints of a segment are P and Q, then the coordinates of the midpoint are M, which is our midpoint formula. So we want to see, can we use this statement to come up with the conclusion to the new statement that they want? Which is, they are now telling us that the endpoints of CD are C and D. They've given us 2 points. Because this is similar to my hypothesis, I can actually make the conclusion and use the midpoint formula on points C and D. I can use this statement to logically prove that if I plug in C and D into my midpoint formula, if I plug in my points into this midpoint formula, I will get the midpoint to these 2 points. So why don't we do that? Why don't we review the midpoint formula right now? While we're at it, we can do C, which is 2 comma negative 4, D, which is negative 3 comma 5, and again we're going to plug these into this formula. I'm allowed to do this because it flows with the conclusion. They started me off with this hypothesis. The endpoints of CD are C, which is 2 comma negative 4, and D, which is negative 3 comma 5. Assuming that this conditional is true and the hypothesis is true, I'm allowed to assume that this conclusion is true for any 2 points. So let's go ahead and let's do x1, y1, and here I have x2, y2. Okay? Using that formula, I would have a 2 plus a negative 3 divided by 2, comma, then I would have a negative 4, which is y1, plus a 5, all divided by 2. If you feel like this was going too fast, you might want to check out the midpoint video, the video on the midpoint formula. That might help you out. Adding and subtracting, we would get negative 1/2, comma, 1/2. So the law of detachment in this problem would allow me to say that the midpoint to CD is negative 1/2, comma, 1/2. And that's how we use the law of detachment. So hopefully now you have a little bit of an understanding what the law of detachment is. Again, this is something that we use as a tool for deductive reasoning. It's a law that helps us prove our logic. Now, what I highly recommend for you to do next, if you feel comfortable with the law of detachment, is to check out the next video on the law of syllogism, which is another tool that we use for deductive reasoning. As always, thanks for watching the videos. Thanks for the likes. I hope you continue to watch them. I hope that they can continue to help you. And if you have questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. And like I said, I hope I see you in another video.